In the 17th century, there was this guy named Shabtai Tzvi. Tzvi was a Jewish Ottoman mystic who had convinced himself that he was the Jewish Messiah. Although young, he was learned enough in both Talmudic and Kabbalistic teachings to garner quite a bit of support. With the aid of his most ardent follower, Nathan Nagazin, he established a cult whose teachings spread far and wide. You see, unlike other cults during most of human history, Nathan was one of the first people to recognize the value of propaganda. He would compose and send missives to Jewish leaders and communities all over the world, not only informing them that, hey, the Messiah had come, but also detailing the various, mostly made-up miracles performed by Tzvi at the time. Tzvi's cult would continue writing and distributing these accounts of Tzvi's imagined exploits to Jews all over the world. They quickly became very popular. These were particularly well received amongst European Jewish communities. Things were pretty bad for Jews in Europe at the time, which honestly could be said about the entirety of European Jewish history up until 1980. People wanted to believe that the Messiah had come, that deliverance from their suffering was at hand. Everywhere in Europe, Tzvi's missives were widely shared and widely believed. Special prayers were raised for him. Readings of his letters were festive occasions. In some places, his initials were carved below the mezuzah in the entrance to synagogues. And then one day, the Ottoman Sultan called Tzvi over. Tzvi was given a choice. If he really was the Messiah, surely he could survive being shot by a barrage of arrows. Or he could abandon the whole Messiah angle and convert to Islam. Tzvi maybe did believe he was the Messiah, but he didn't believe it that much. He converted to Islam, with some of his followers following suit. Tzvi's converts and their descendants are actually the subject of a bunch of modern-day Turkish conspiracy theories, but the story isn't really about that. Tzvi's conversion was a blow to European Jews, to say the least. In the wake of Shabtai's conversion, assorted rules and restrictions were placed on the teachings of the Kabbalah as though that were the root cause of the fanatic reach of Tzvi's movement. But I think sometimes of that man, men in plural, who were charged with scraping off the initials of Shabtai Tzvi from the doorways of synagogues all over the world, of the resigned shame and anger they must have felt. Anyway, I told you that story to tell you this one. In May of 2024, Spain, along with Norway and Ireland, declared its recognition of the state of Palestine. This following months of something that, by sheer number of dead and mutilated children, it feels vaguely criminal to call simply a war. A genocide that is ongoing as I write these lines, the sights of which will probably never leave me. Israel's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Israel Katz, made several tweets of mostly rambling nonsense, of the I'm not gonna read all that genre of tweet that's all too common on the site now that it's under the reign of its new pedophile associate and car bomb manufacturing owner. Something in the final line of one of them caught my eye, though. If this ignorant, hate-filled individual, referring here to Yolanda Diaz, Spain's deputy prime minister, wants to understand what radical Islam truly seeks, she should study the 700 years of Islamic rule in Al-Andalus, today's Spain. This was interesting to me, since that period he's talking about, the Islamic rule of Al-Andalus, has a name in Hebrew. It's called Tor HaZahav, the Golden Age, since it saw an unprecedented bloom in Jewish social and financial status. There were some hiccups, sure, but Jews overall were far better off in Al-Andalus than anywhere else in Christian Europe at the time. The Golden Age ended with the final completion of the Reconquista, when the combined arms of the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile managed to dislodge the last Islamic emirate out of the peninsula. Despite Jewish communities lending money and arms to the campaign, this victory was followed almost immediately by the Alhambra Declaration, expelling all Jews who wouldn't convert to Christianity from Spanish lands. The Christian retaking of Spain led to the end of one of the most culturally significant eras of European Jewry and initiated one of its greatest calamities. So why is this Israeli minister talking about it like it was a good thing? Could it be that he's simply that stupid? Sure, he's from Likud. That's certainly a possibility. Ignorance is a virtue for Likudniks. They pride themselves on it. More on that later. But I think this is something else. Zionism as a whole isn't necessarily fascist, I guess. There's been some pretty left-wing versions of it, some that accepted Palestinians as human beings and didn't seek to ethnically cleanse or disenfranchise them. Famously, Kaplansky floated the idea of there being a state that, while welcoming to diaspora Jews, may still be majority Palestinian and administered as such by them. But he got his shit rocked by Ben Gurion, so here we are. Like I said, Zionism may be a racist ideology, sure, it's explicitly colonialistic, as outlined by its designers, but it's not inherently fascist. It just sort of trends towards fascism. The same way that eating a chicken McNugget can lead to eating 19 more chicken McNuggets. They come in the same box. The more, shall we say, liberal factions of Zionism cannot meaningfully deal with its extremist factions, cannot distance themselves from them, and thus were doomed from the jump to fall prey to them. From the moment that former Irgun members were allowed to integrate into the IDF freely, all hope was lost on that front. Israel's failure to quash the settler movement early on, or failure isn't the right word since it's baked into the system, unwillingness rather, meant that its most extreme factions will only grow stronger with time. And the current government of Israel, led by a political pyromaniac and rogues gallery of insane settlers with insectoid hearts and some with literal terrorism convictions in their past, is fascist as all hell. Fascism needs an enemy. In fact, it needs a cascade of enemies, nested Mitrayushka dolls of enemies. It is an engine built entirely on conflict and opposition, because it appeals to those who fetishize strength and power. To the Nazis, it wasn't just the Jews. It's the Jewish global conspiracy pulling the strings on communist and Untermenschen people to destroy the Aryan race. To American fascists, it's not just immigrants. It's a secret communist liberal cabal using trans people to destroy masculinity and facilitate the Great Replacement. Moving targets that can be easily shifted under one umbrella, one great context of conflict. For Israel, it's not just the Palestinians. It's worldwide Islam trying to topple poor little plucky Israel via its Iranian cohorts. They may make some positive gestures towards Arab Gulf countries, they'll make TikToks from Dubai, but to the average Israeli, the true enemy at the heart of the entire Arab-Israeli conflict is Islam itself. It is an attempt by a fledgling nation to recontextualize its singular regional conflict as a thousands-year battle that's been going on since biblical times. They hate us because of their religion. And largely, this projection of reality has been successfully accepted by certain people. How many people have you seen or met who, in response to some news about Israel-Palestine, leave a comment like, "Oh, the world would be better without religion," or "See how dangerous religion is"? This is not only a misunderstanding of the conflict as a whole, it plays into the Zionist paradigm. Oh, it's not the stolen land, the tens of thousands of dead, the hundreds of thousands of misplaced refugees, constant apartheid and cultural suppression. No, see, it's a religious conflict. This obfuscation is necessary for Zionism to function, and a swinging back door for fascism to usurp it. The Palestinian resistance, Hezbollah, Iran, these are just, for now, enemies, within the greater framework of the Islamic threat, a threat Zionists manufactured wholesale. Historically speaking, the Islamic world was always much kinder to Jews than its Christian counterpart. Jews and Muslims fought together on the walls of Jerusalem against the Crusaders. In Islamic countries, Jews could become doctors, scholars, state officials. In the Christian kingdoms, they could aspire to such high ranks as usurer and, What the fuck is a court Jew? The truth is, if Zionists could marshal the support of Islamic countries for their proposed state, which they have tried, things would look much different now. Perhaps an Israeli minister would be chanting death to America as they criticize US Army bases along the Mediterranean, but Turkey lost the First World War, so they had to rely on the Christian world instead, and thus oriented themselves as enemies of Islam. This playing around with history to fit a presupposed pattern is the Zionist playbook in a nutshell, reframing the Zionist movement and the State of Israel as the only place Jews can feel safe. It's the only refuge of Jews in the world that's out to get them. Every offensive action then becomes an act of self-defense. Oh, we had to blow up that hospital, that school, those kids playing soccer. It's self-defense. We have to wipe Gaza off the map, they say. It's the only way to be safe. We have to invade Lebanon again to regain our safety, and then we'll deal with Yemen and Iran for safety's sake. Israel has not made Jews safe. It's made them more vulnerable than ever. Several million of them are sitting on the Middle East's biggest powder keg, held by messianic madmen who believe they're the ones who have to kickstart Gog and Magog if the Arabs won't do it, with an arsenal of nuclear weapons to make sure that if they do go down, they'll take as many innocent lives with them. Not to mention how all of this is affecting Jewish people abroad. Israel has been, and I foresee in future centuries, will be remembered as a disaster for the Jewish people. We are witnessing a catastrophe unfold in real time, its threads loosening, spinning wildly through the air, the entire thing unfolding into nothingness. If you've watched so far, I'll drop a doozy on you. I'm not Jewish. I'm a resident of Israel by chains of poverty, but I'm not a citizen. But I do have an immense love of the Jewish faith, amidst which I grew up, and the storied, fascinating history of its peoples, in Europe, in Africa, in India, and elsewhere. And as an amateur scholar of Jewish history, Israel appalls me. Many Zionists will argue that being anti-Zionist is akin to being anti-Semitic. This is something all nationalist movements do. They present themselves as the sole representatives of the group they're nationalistic towards. If you disagree with their movement, they'll portray you as being against the group as a whole. Oh, you're against Nazis? Why do you hate the German people? You're anti-fascist? That just means anti-white, etc., etc. If a member of the group goes against the movement, they're a race traitor in white nationalist parlance, or a self-hating Jew in a Zionist version. But Israel, though it may be a Jewish state, is not representative of world Jewish communities, even if they do pretend to be. Israel has been a hole into which Jewish culture was sucked up to be destroyed, to be remade into Israeli culture, which is mostly just European Jewish culture with some Arabic flavor, but even that has been destructive to European Jews. Let me explain what I mean. Let's start with language, since it's a great signifier of cultural erasure. Yiddish used to be the lingua franca in the northern European Jewish communities. If you knew it, you can go from France all the way to Russia and still be able to speak fluently with any Jewish person you met along the way, even secular ones, no matter their nationality. Fun fact, in World War II, many Russian frontline troops lacked German interpreters, so Jewish soldiers were used to interrogate captured Nazis on the fly, since Yiddish and German are intelligible. This is the sort of fun fact that isn't even brought up in modern Israeli history classes. I know because I've been through them. Yiddish, its history or cultural significance, isn't taught at all. Now don't get me wrong, I like Hebrew. Bringing it back from extinction is legitimately one of the only cool, noble things Zionism has accomplished. It's a beautiful language, it's incredibly poetic, and I say this as somebody who used to write cringy poems as a teen. But from the jump, modern Hebrew was used as a political tool. Zionism's earliest detractors were left-wing, mostly communist Jews, who later formed the Jewish Bund. The Bund saw Zionism as a nationalistic movement that stood anathema to communism. The Bund also encouraged the use of Yiddish, and it was the main language used in its publications. Zionists then countered by focusing on Hebrew. Even after the bond was made irrelevant and later dismantled after the final formation of the USSR, to Zionists, Yiddish was still culturally the language of the Golah, the exile. Hebrew was the sole Jewish language of Israel, and if you wanted to integrate into this new country, you had to learn it. There were no provisions for the preservation of any other Jewish language, not even symbolic ones. Yiddish, a language spoken for hundreds of years by millions of Jews, which had already suffered a huge blow by having a considerable part of its speakers massacred in the Holocaust, was left to rot away. Today, the only reason it's not fully extinct is because of the Jewish Orthodox community. Many Orthodox households prefer to speak Yiddish, particularly at home, rather than Hebrew, which they consider sacred. While these dialects of Yiddish are different and they drift further away from the popular Yiddish of the 19th and 20th century, the language is at least safe from complete annihilation, which is more than what could be said of Ladino. While Yiddish was the lingua franca of the North, Ladino was widely spoken in the South. Derived from Old Spanish, this is a Jewish language that spread all over the Mediterranean after the aforementioned Spanish expulsion. Today it's spoken by a few tens of thousands of elderly people, and will likely become completely extinct in the coming decades. And isn't that a shame? Isn't it all a shame? Those are just two languages, but there are others. Jews developed their own dialects everywhere they went, from Tet to Judeo-Marathi. These are wonderfully rich and interesting tongues that came to Israel to die. The only people who still consistently pass on their native language to their kids generation after generation in Israel are Russians and Ukrainians, mostly because they came in very large numbers after the fall of the USSR, and their social cohesion helped maintain a more parallel culture. Who knows how long that will hold? The Ethiopians haven't been as lucky. Beta Israel is one of the oldest and most interesting Jewish populations in the world. They have had their own kingdoms, royal lines, wars, their own versions of holy texts, their own holidays. But when they came to Israel, some airlifted and smuggled out by foot into what they were told was the Promised Land, they immediately faced pressure from Israelis to assimilate, to abandon their cultures. Many Western Jewish rabbis questioned whether they can really be considered Jewish, since their version of Judaism wasn't Talmudic. Nothing, and I mean jack shit, is taught about Ethiopian Jewish history in schools or the difficulties they faced in coming here. Many of them still speak Amharic dialects, but that's starting to degrade with subsequent generations. A considerable portion of them are also converting from the Haymanot traditions of their parents to Rabbinical Judaism, the correct version of Judaism, according to Rabbinical Jews. But by far, the group that was shred the most into an unrecognizable form by the Israeli cultural apparatus were Arabic-speaking Jews. A misnomer often used in Israel itself is Mizrahi, or Eastern Jews. That's more of an umbrella term for any Jewish people who weren't from Northern Europe, and so it includes Arabic-speaking Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, but also Persian and Mid-Asian Jews, as well as Mediterranean Jews from Turkey and Greece and elsewhere. Arabic-speaking Jews were some of the first non-European immigrants to Israel and faced discrimination from European Jews from pretty much day one. And I mean since before the state was founded. I'm not even talking about the Ma'abara days. Arabic-speaking Jews, coming from all over the Arabic world, faced incredible pressures from the Nazi and Israeli culture to abandon their previous cultures and become Israeli. You want to talk about language death? In my 30-some-odd years in this country, I've met a lot of people born to Iraqi, Egyptian, Syrian, Yemenite Jews. Not a single one of them spoke Arabic, even if their parents or grandparents did. It was simply unadvantageous to pass it down in Israeli culture, and younger generations didn't see the point in learning it to begin with. I mean, it's not like they're surrounded by Arabic speakers or anything. Orthodox Mizrahis? That was not a thing that existed. Shas did not exist. This is what religious Mizrahis looked like before the State of Israel, not much different than religious Muslims in their home countries. This is what they look like now, fully adopting the European Orthodox style, abandoning their own for the sake of assimilation, because their grandparents, upon coming to this culture, were told that they weren't Jewish enough. Despite being a leftist bloc in the past, being a disenfranchised group in a European-run country, today the descendants of Arabic-speaking Mizrahis are fully assimilated, which means they're the most right-leaning bloc in Israeli society right now. It's the same story with every other group. Zionism is a unifying force, and it is a destructive force. It takes other cultures and blends them together, but only shreds survive. Schnitzel and hummus, Mizrahi music and pilmeni, gefilte fish and chamsas, blended cultural signifiers, foods and artifacts devoid of their cultural significance. This isn't a cultural melting pot. It's an ashery, and it has reached a critical point. Israeli culture is now fully crystallized. It is self-sustaining, a Frankenstein, but alive, living, and killing. A question I get asked when people find out I live here is some variation of, why are Israelis like that? Why are they so racist and pushy and obnoxious and self-centered? Why are thousands of massacred children a joke to them? Why are they like that, man? Well, one can point to Zionism itself, an explicitly racist ideology that at the same time attempts to justify its racism through the historic tragedies of the Jewish people. One can point to the fact that Israeli children are indoctrinated to believe that Jews have a superior claim to the land, and that this indoctrination on its own includes, by omission, the disenfranchisement and dehumanization of other people. Myself, I can offer a semblance of a theory, I suppose, insofar as why they're so lacking in empathy, why they'll look you dead-eyed and smile as they talk about wiping out entire swaths of human beings, why they fall so easily into racist and right-wing ideologies, and I can only approach it vis-a-vis the Palestinian issue. First, you need to understand that Israelis are not educated about the Palestinian people. Their history, culture, nothing. Palestinians live an hour's drive away from most Israelis, and the vast majority of Israelis wouldn't be able to name a single Palestinian author or poet or celebrity. Nothing is taught of Palestine in schools. Nothing is explained about them in mass media. Even now, all those pictures of dead and mutilated children, bodies buried in rubble, body parts flown across ruined tent encampments, the skeletal remains of men and women executed with their hands zip-tied behind their backs, none of that is shown in Israeli media. In fact, by even mentioning any of that stuff, I could be accused of spreading enemy propaganda. But in particular, apart from the current war, the daily tribulations Palestinians face, the extent of their lack of control of their own lives and land, the hardships Israel as both a state and a society heaps on them, Israelis are oblivious to all of it. So, in their minds, Palestinian violence occurs in a vacuum. They don't understand it, so they attribute it to some inherent evil. The theft of land, the constant oppression, denying the people the right to the very water in the aquifers under their feet, the air above their heads, the waves that they fished over for hundreds of years, is so ingrained as some just pioneering project that Israelis are left to scratch their heads when Palestinians resist these artifices by force of arms, and in turn accept that violence inflicted on them must therefore be appropriate and necessary. Where darkness is allowed to breed, monsters grow. You see, it's relatively easy to dislodge from the mind of a person an opinion someone else instilled in them. This is why, despite being so prominent, Nazi educational material failed to take root after the fall of the Reich. It's easy to accept that someone has been lying to you. But an opinion you've come by yourself, that's a lot harder, because it involves accepting that you've been lying to yourself. Zionism is wise to this. It employs ignorance strategically. Most nationalistic movements do nowadays if they're smart. A person will defend an opinion they've been led to due to ignorance with surprising pertinacity, even when presented with facts to the contrary. And once you've been led to accept that, geez, these people are just naturally evil. They're human animals with hate in their hearts, etc., etc., thinking that these are just observations you've come by yourself, you can be led to accept any racist position they're on. The boundaries of your morality have been breached. The poison permeates the flesh of the mind. And Zionism enforces these beliefs with repeated trauma. The constant ringing of tragedies past, constant reliving of past events. Israeli society doesn't believe in healing. That's not a process you're supposed to go through. You're supposed to constantly be reminded of our collective national traumas and constantly live within them. Is there any surprise then that among developed nations, Israel constantly rates high on percentages of both adult pot smokers and antidepressant users? Now, I don't mean to excuse Israeli racism, by the way, by saying that they were led to it. It's contingent on every individual to examine one's own beliefs, and not all Israelis are heinous monsters. Many have deprogrammed themselves, but enough are, and most of those who are in charge. Which brings us to the title of the video. Given all of this, what is the future of Zionism? Israel could have had peace with the Palestinians decades ago. They traded the Sinai in exchange for lasting peace and economic ties to Egypt. They exchanged water rights and control of the Temple Mount in exchange for lasting peace and economic ties with Jordan. What's so different? If indeed, as Zionists claim, there is no Palestinian people and it's all just Arabs, by their own twisted logic, what makes these Arabs worthy of peace and others of slaughter? Of course, there's no internal logic to any of it. The truth of the matter is that Israel needs the Palestinians the same way that Sparta needed Helots, a captive population to test weapons on, to reprove constantly the national warrior myth, to exemplify how strong and brave our troops are and how depraved and debased their rabble is. Israel will never sign a lasting peace treaty with the Palestinians. The Israeli arms industry depends on their subjugation. The Israeli right needs them as boogeymen. The Israeli national myth demands their blood to flow constantly. But a sea change is occurring, and this steadfast refusal to deal in peace will be this country's unraveling. Never in my life have I witnessed such an outpouring of support for Palestine, such widespread condemnation of the Israeli war machine, such public disgust with what Israel considers normalcy, particularly among the young. It is impossible to hide war crimes in this day and age, and doubly so when the ones doing them broadcast them on social media. The old guard is still in command, still tied with the strings of the Israeli lobby, but boomers and Gen Xers, who grew up on the well-polished myth of plucky little Israel, tech nation, Hamas enthusiasts who are standing bravely against barbarism or whatever, won't be in power for long, and even among them cracks are showing. I legitimately believe that in entering Gaza and leveling its neighborhoods, Israel undid the seal of its own destruction. A process that should have taken decades has been rapidly shortened. Israel can act with impunity while they have the authority of the United States, but to coin a phrase, the problem with Middle Eastern nationalism is that eventually you run out of other countries' bombs. The top brass of Israel understand this, I feel, but most Israelis don't. They live in their own reality, a reality based on wishful thinking, on trust me bro and yeah beseda. They see the great ball of the sun and do not understand that it is setting on them. Fascism cannot envision its own demise, and as I've said, the distance between fascism and Zionism is only shortening with every generation. Liberal Zionists will point out to the daily protests against the government and Netanyahu, but Netanyahu is not an aberration. He is Zionism's golden son. Himself the son of a Stern Gang supporter, he has spent decades meticulously setting up the ladders that brought him into power. He is the product. And when he's gone, Israel doesn't magically correct course into a gentler, more humane apartheid. A worse version will climb up those ladders instead. All the so-called center-left, which is really just an anti-Netanyahu right, can do in Israel is protest. They will never wake up to the fact that if they want to change things, they actually have to seize the reins of power and change them. Why, that would be illegal. Ben-Gvir and his ilk will not change their tune once X amount of people go out into the streets to call him ruiner of the state, because at the end of the day he knows, as they all know, that the system exists to protect and enshrine their ideology. It's not that the system is rotten. It's working perfectly. It is simply profane. A system built on destruction within and without. Destruction of Jewish culture in favor of an Israeli monoculture. Destruction of the Palestinians for Lebensraum. An engine of destruction can only end up destroying itself. It is inevitable. The future of Zionism? I told you that story to bring you back to this one. I think sometimes of that man, scraping away the initials of Shabtai Tzvi from the doorway of the synagogue, the shame, the anger, the resignation he feels in that moment. But that moment will pass. The sun shines on him, and the wind blows, and God sighs another day into being, and the world keeps going. It keeps going. Judaism will survive Israel, as it has survived every calamity, as it has survived the Sabbatean delusion of Tzvi. God sighs, and the world keeps moving. The Messianics will fight to their last, in all likelihood, consumed by the need to immanentize the eschaton, but the world will forget them too. It has forgotten the Kanaim, the Skitari. I do not know if that state which will survive this place will be Palestinian or some South African-style compromise, but it will not be Israel, and I cannot say how much blood will soak into the soil before then, or how many souls it will take to hold up the sky above that country, if mine will be in that number. But I can tell you this much. It is not in the distant future. It is soon. I'd like to close with a 1948 quote from Hannah Arendt, written for the then left-wing Commentary magazine, today a right-wing Zionist rag, sadly. Arendt was a Zionist, had spent time in Zionist settlements in Palestine during the 30s, while in exile from her native Germany, but curiously became opposed to a Jewish ethno-state when its existence started to loom closer. Possibly her experience with an ethno-state of a different variety colored her skepticism. I found this quote right as I ended writing this video and found it reflects much of what I've said, but I'm just a guy, and Arendt is a world-recognized political philosopher, so maybe her words will have a little more impact. There is very little doubt about the final outcome of an all-out war between Arabs and Jews. One can win many battles without winning a war, and up to now no real battle has yet taken place in Palestine, and even if the Jews were to win the war, its end would find the unique possibilities and unique achievements of Zionism in Palestine destroyed. The land that would come into being would be something quite other than the dreams of world Jewry, Zionist and non-Zionist. The victorious Jews would live surrounded by an entirely hostile Arab population, secluded inside ever-threatened borders, absorbed with physical self-defense to a degree that would submerge all other interests and activities. The growth of a Jewish culture would cease to be the concern of the whole people. Social experiments would have to be discarded as impractical luxuries. Political thought would center around military strategy. Economic development would be determined exclusively by the needs of war. And all this would be the fate of a nation that, no matter how many immigrants it could still absorb, or how far it extends its boundaries, would still remain a very small people, greatly outnumbered by hostile neighbors. Under such circumstances, the Palestinian Jews would degenerate into one of those small warrior tribes about whose possibilities and importance history has amply informed us since the days of Sparta. Their relations with world Jewry would become problematical, since their defense interests might clash with any moment with those of other countries where large numbers of Jews lived. Palestine Jewry would eventually separate itself from the larger body of the world Jewry, and in its isolation develop into an entirely new people. Thus, it becomes plain that at this moment, and under present circumstances, a Jewish state can only be erected at the price of a Jewish homeland. Anyway, thanks for listening.